There we go. Okay. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this SICS Research Seminar. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located, and pay respects to their elders, both past and present. I'm Simon Wakeling. I'm a lecturer here in the School of Information and Communication Studies. I'm hosting this on behalf of the school's research committee. We like to keep track of who's attending these research seminars. So if it's not too much to ask, if you could just briefly pop into the chat box your name and where you're from, that would be really helpful for us. And as I mentioned, we are recording this session. So today's presentation is about scholarly journal publishing in Australia, and our presenter is Associate Professor Hamid Jamali. Hamid received his PhD in Information Science from University College London in 2008, and his research interests basically cover the area of scholarly communication, so including reading, citing and publishing behaviour, journal publishing, open access and research evaluation. Hamid's been involved in multiple international projects, including two recent projects on the scholarly communication of early career researchers. For those who don't know, Hamid was recognised recently in the Australian's 2021 Research magazine as the top researcher in Australia in library and information science. So I'm sure it'll be a fascinating presentation, and I'll pass over to you now, Hamid.
Thank you, Simon, and hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this seminar. So this is about the scholarly journal publishing in Australia. And first, so the work is basically the work I did during my SSD that just finished early in November, with help from Simon Wakeling. Simon, feel free to chip in when I miss something or you want to contribute anything. And also another friend from University of New South Wales, but you can blame me for all of the mistakes and errors because most of the legwork basically I did during the SSB. They brought a lot of ideas and good contribution to the research. I would like to start with a few questions to make you think about issues that could be related to what the research that we did. And these questions, as you see, the first one is about if you ever had a paper you submitted to journals and they said, international journals, and they said, oh, this is too local, or the issue is not interesting for our international readership. Or whether you care about the journal is local or Australian, if you're Australian or you're basically working here, and when you decide where to publish, and do you think about how publishable the output of your research will be when you decide what research you want to do? So when you're thinking about those questions, this research started for me with this question I had in mind based on knowledge of a few Australian journals that I knew. And the question was, how can Australian journals do better in terms of performance? For instance, how can they have a better impact factor or attract more international papers and so on? And I wanted to find out about that. And the first step obviously was to get to know Australian journals, because there is no list of them and nobody knew how many journals we have and who is publishing them and what they are and so on. So I started doing that research, and through that research, I realized that actually that is the wrong question for many of these journals, because if you talk to their editors, many of them would say that actually we don't want to perform better in the sense that I was thinking about, which is a higher impact factor or more international contribution and so on. And the question changed for me through the course of this research to how these journals can be more sustainably published and do the functions that they are supposed to have. And you can see a list of those functions for journals that can be considered local journals, domestic journals, or national journals. They also sometimes call it small journals or periphery journals. And I understand not all of them consider themselves national. Not all of them are small. Some of them might be big. Some of them might actually, if you talk to the editors, although they might be called Australian journals, the editors would say we consider ourselves an international journal in terms of the scope and so on. But they have some value and the values you can see here, one of the important ones is that they provide venue for research on issues with local significance. For instance, if you're doing research on First Nation and indigenous culture, then probably a local Australian journal is a better outlet for you to publish in than international journals, because that might not be of an issue of interest, for instance, to British researchers or people in Italy or Spain and so on and so forth. But also they inform practice, like in health science, GP practices are very different here compared, for instance, to Canada or France and so on. So what you publish in journals that are considered local or national, they inform practice, they link academics and practitioners, they provide an outlet, they make the country's research more visible, they have educational role and professional role and societal roles and so on. So some of these functions are things that international journals cannot necessarily do. And that's why we need journals that are local or domestic or national. Australian journals, before we started this research, we didn't know much about them. Not much research has been done. Some research like 10, 20 years ago. A few research showed that generally speaking, arts and humanities and social science journals, Australian journals, have low inclusion in Web of Science. And if you're aiming to publish in the prestigious journals, if you're a social scientist, therefore you don't have a lot of options. Also, arts and humanities and social scientists in Australia and in many other countries, they are more likely to publish in local journals, because probably they think that the topic of their research is more suitable for those outlets, for journals that are local. So what we did for this study, the first question for me was to map the landscape of journal publishing in Australia, basically understand how many journals we have and who is publishing them and what's the nature of publication and so on. But when I did that, I realized that through the course of the study, we found out that there were many journals that they're supposed to be active journals, but they ceased publication in the last decade or so. And then we did a second study, which was a study of Australian journals that discontinue. So we looked at their characteristics, but also we did a quick survey of the editors of those journals that ceased publications. The way we did research, we looked at the databases, mostly ORIC database, to find out any journal that could be potentially Australian, journals that had Australia or Australian or Australasia in their title, journals that had Australia as the place of the publication recorded in databases. So we obtained a list of all of those journals from ORIC, Web of Science, Scopus, DOAJ, which is Director of Open Access Journals, and ERA list, the ERA 2018 list, you are familiar with. Then we went through them and determined whether they were Australian. We could consider them as Australian journal or not. And the definition we used was that not necessarily having the term in the title or having the place of publication as Australia, but whether they belonged to or were affiliated with an Australian entity. And that entity could be a learned society, a professional association, a university, or a local Australian small publisher. The first study was active journals. We identified 650 Australian journals that are published and they are active. 240 of them, they had the term Australia or Australian in title. So they are called Australian Journal of, for instance, Chemistry and so on. 57 of them, they had the terms Australasia or Australasian in the title. And at least 88% of them are actually published in Australia. So the place of publication is Australia, but the rest could be published somewhere else by another publisher but they belong to Australian entities here. And that entity might have outsourced the publication to them. Number of journals launched each year, you can see that started obviously in, I think, 19th century. And so up to 1900, there were 9 journals, and then you can see the number goes up. After the Second World War, you can see the increase of the number of journals. 1990s was the decade with the largest number of new journals being launched, with 1993, I think, was the top year with 17 new journals. But if you look at the trend for the active journals, the journals that are actually currently active, you can see the trend is downward. You can see the number of new journals decreased after 1990s, but also the number of journals that are active in the last decade. You can see that in 2011, from 695, perhaps it dropped to about 648 in 2020. So it seems that there is a crisis, or a lot of these journals actually face difficulties, and therefore they have to discontinue and shut. In terms of corporate author, and corporate author is defined as the entity or organization that sponsors the editorial processes, like the learned society that owns the journals, or a university that the journal is affiliated with. And you can see that the majority of the journals are either, they belong either to non-profit organizations, whether professional associations or learned societies, or usually universities. So 55% of them non-profit, and another 25% of them they belong to universities more. When you look at how they are published, so you can see in this graph that journals that belong to non-profit organizations, about half of them, they are self-published, which means that the society itself is publishing the journal. But a good number of them, in this line here, you can see that 162 of them, the society or the association or that non-profit organization, they have outsourced the publication to a large international commercial publisher, such as Taylor and Francis, or Elsevier, or Sage, Wiley, and Blackwell, and so on. In the case of universities or educational institutions, the majority are self-published, which means that the university itself is publishing the journals. And for many of other categories, like the journals that belong to government, or journals that they are published by a small commercial publisher in Australia, they are all self-published. So this category here are self-published. So 425 out of 651 journals, they are published by the organization that they actually own the journal, rather than outsourcing the publication to a publisher. In terms of the inclusion in databases, out of all of the journals that you can see a large number of them are actually listed in ERA in 2018 ERA list. So about 569 out of 650 journals, they were included in ERA list, but about half of them only are listed in the Scopus. So out of 650, 326 Australian journals are indexed in the Scopus, and less than half of them are indexed in Web of Science. And out of that half, also a large number of them are in the emerging sources citation database, citation index, which is a less prestigious component of Web of Science citation indexes, because the more prestigious ones are social science citation index, and science citation index, and arts and humanities citation index. So, and this is in line with the findings in the past that in terms of the coverage of journals in Australian journals in major international citation databases. In terms of the FOR code of the journals, so journals had FOR code in the ERA list. Those that didn't have, we assigned FOR code to them based on the topic area and the scope of the journal. And you can see that here, a large number of the journals are actually codes from 13 to 22, which you can consider as arts, humanities, and social sciences. The number of journals that are in pure and natural and life sciences are less, which means, and this is again in line with what the experts say, that a lot of local journals have more significance in social sciences, arts, and humanities, because authors are more likely to publish and look for local journals for publications. And you can see that a lot of these Australian journals are actually social science and arts and humanities journals. But at the same time, you can see that most of the journals that are indexed actually in Web of Science and Scopus, they are from natural life sciences and pure sciences, rather than social sciences and humanities. So the percentage of inclusion in Web of Science and Scopus, you can see is lower here in this area than, for instance, 68%, 80%, etc. But in terms of ERA, about 90% of journals are included in ERA. Open access, we looked at the publishing model of journals, because journals, in order to survive, they need to have some financial health. They need to be funded properly, either making money or somebody pays for them for their publication. A large number of them, about 34% of them or more, about 39% of them are open access or free in a way. And most of them, they don't charge authors. So they are free for authors and free for readers, which means somebody else is paying for the publication of those journals. And that could be the learned society or the professional association that owns the journal, or the university. So somebody's funding the journal for the publication, and the journal is free for readers and authors. A few of them had embargo, which means they're not free. You have to pay for the subscription, but they make all of the content available for free after 6 months or after a year after the publication. Most of the journals that have been outsourced to large international publishers are hybrid, which means they are subscription, but if you pay for individual articles, you can make your article publish your article in open access. And some of them were subscription, mostly probably those that belong to societies, because that's one of the benefits that society membership gets you if you become a member of society. And you can see that nonprofit organization journals, most of the hybrid journals, they belong to them. And here for the university, you see that the majority of journals from universities are open access, no APC. APC means author process in charge, which means that the university is paying for the journal, and the journal is free for readers and authors. That was the study about active Australian journals. Then, as I said, when we were collecting the data for that study, we realized I came across many journals that actually ceased publication. And interestingly, a few quiet in the last year or so. And there were a statement in some cases on the journals that they actually shut down because of the COVID. So as you have read in the news that about 40,000 jobs were lost in Australian higher education. So the workload issue, the funding problem at universities and other organizations, all of those have probably contributed, will contribute, I should say, to the sustainability of a lot of these journals. And you can expect that more journals will cease publication as a result of COVID and as a result of the loss of academic jobs and the funding from university and so on. We identified 140 journals that ceased publication just in the last decade, so from 2011 onward. And when we looked at their characteristics, we found that most of them, they belonged either to universities, 54%, or societies and associations. And the majority of them, 95%, were self-published, which means the university published them. It wasn't a commercial publisher, or the society published them. And again, the majority of them were arts, humanities, and social sciences, which is concerning because this is the area that you would need more local journals, because scholars in these areas look for more local journals because they want to publish in local journals to get that audience from the country. And this is the distribution of FOR codes. You can see that from codes 13 up to 22, there are more journals here than, let's say, physics or chemistry. So there was no journal from physics that discontinued, no chemistry journal, a few earth sciences, but there were a lot of journals like in human society, which is sociology and so on, or legal journals, or creative arts journals, and communication, culture, etc. We did a quick survey. So we looked at the contact. We found the last name editor of those journals that discontinued. Then we went on and searched for their current contact in detail for them. And we did a quick, like SurveyMonkey short survey. 53 of them out of 135 that I contacted, we completed the survey during 2 weeks. And we found that we asked a few questions about, how the journal was funded, if they made any money or not, profit or loss, and what was the reason for discontinuation, how they, what contributed to that decision to cease the journal. We found that most of them, they were either subscription-based or they were diamond open access, which means free for readers, free for authors, which means somebody paid for them. So they relied on the funding from the university or the parent organization that actually owned the journal. And when we looked at the funding, we asked them how the journals were funded. They either relied on parent organization to pay for them, 66%, or they didn't. They said no funding was needed because basically, you know, the university paid for the hosting of the website, for instance, and the editor was working for free, the reviewers were working for free, and therefore they thought that there was no cost attached or no cash was needed for the publication of the journal because they relied on voluntary work or the support from the parent organization for other infrastructure if there was an office and so on. We asked them if they, you know, the financial health at the last year. We said, what happened in the last year? As you can see, no journal made a profit. 10 of them made a loss in the last year. 12 of them, they said, broke even. Some didn't know because maybe the society or university was managing the finance and the editor wasn't aware of what was going on in terms of finance. And there were other things. And some of them actually didn't consider this question relevant because they didn't consider their journal as a for-profit initiative. They thought, you know, journal is for scholarship and science, therefore we don't consider it as a matter of making profit or loss, which might be true, but at the same time, it has implication for sustainability of publication of journals. We asked them what contributed to the discontinuation decision. We put forward a few reasons, but there were options also for them to add anything else. One was lack of quality submission, difficulty to find reviewers, and so on. The most important one was this funding. As you can see, this was a Likert scale question from not at all to a great extent. It's free, with 40-something% of them saying to a large extent or to a very great extent, this was the reason why we couldn't continue the journal. The second top reason was lack of support, which is again related to the funding. And I have some more information. So these are some comments from the editors when they answered that question. Funding was 45.6%, they said large to a great extent. And they said, you know, became financially unviable for the organization to continue producing. Lack of support, you can see comments like we operated on a shoestring about $4,000 a year to publish, but the university would not support this any longer, and so on. Other reasons were included lack of quality submission, like too much competition from other emerging journals, submissions dried up, or the impact of ERA journal ranking. Before 2018 ERA list actually apparently included rankings of journals, and that, as you can see here, basically they affected the reputation because they reduced the ranking of that specific journal, and therefore nobody submitted to that journal. Biggest disengagement of key people, retirement of the editor, and inability to locate replacement. And this was related to another reason that we didn't include, but there were a lot of comments in there. A lot of editors commented about this, which is workload. And that is a lot of them actually doing voluntary work, or even if they are paid, the payment doesn't match basically the amount of work that they do. So when some editor retire or they leave the university or that learn a society, the work is not appealing to somebody else to step in and say, I'm going to be the editor, because it's too much work for little gain. Many universities don't pay any credit for being editor, especially if the journal is not Q1 or Q2. And there is no payment attached to it, a lot of workload, and therefore is not appealing. And once a key person leaves the journal, it becomes very difficult to find somebody else to actually replace that editor or key people or running the journal. I put some quotations here. I don't want to talk too much because basically what We want to continue this line of research, and what is more interesting for us is to listen to your comments and ideas and questions. I have a few quotations from editors who responded, and you can see they commented on like the hardship of regional journals to attract submissions and basically survive due to all of these competitions. I think locally focused papers are getting harder to publish, and all work is expected to be placed in a wider global context. Authors also need to meet academic standards that are hard for a journal of this type to compete with. For another one is saying, the journal stopped publishing 2000 something due to principally to the supply of Australian authored articles drying up. We were getting third-rate submissions from overseas, but had little energy to continue the journal with this as the main fodder. The lack of supply of domestic content was mainly due to Australian authors' disincentive to publish in lower-ranked journals because of university and research organizations' KPIs. And we see that in our RPI as well, that you need to publish in Q1 and Q2 to get more points if you need more points. Or editorial has some, you get some points, but if the journal is, for instance, Q1 and Q2, if you're the editor of a lowly ranked local journals in humanities, you're not going to get much credit, and you have to do a lot of work for it. Another one, this is long one, and it's probably last one. Currently operating, which I understand have brought up smaller presses and can now decide to drop a journal if they think it doesn't make a profit, have a big enough audience or whatever. Journals also rely on voluntary contributions by academics, and this is getting harder to access, as no university I know wants their academic staff doing gratis tasks in paid work time. And in fact, the workloads are so enormous that many academics won't do reviews or write for a journal that is not blessed with a high impact factor. I have wondered if the whole scene is going to crumble at some point, perhaps other than journals like the British Medical Journal, and a great deal of knowledge lost except to local or networked academic communities, especially in niche areas. It is somehow ironic that at a time when information can flow around the globe in seconds, that important knowledge is in recognized publications can be extinguished on merely a commercial basis. So there were a lot of concerns on the side of editors about the loss of local journals, but lack of incentive for authors to contribute to local journals. The other concern that we came across, and this has been documented in the literature as well, that journals actually, especially if they are online, they can be lost forever. So the journal is discontinued, nobody pays for the website, and they disappear. And if they're not archived, or there is no plan to conserve the content for long term for future, then you might lose the content. All of the contributions that authors made and wrote the paper might be lost forever. So we added another question. We said, did you have a plan for conservation? Some of them didn't at the time. We also asked them if the journals, if some of the articles or all of the articles are available online now that the journals is not published anymore. That wasn't the case for all. As you see, some of them were not available at all. Some of them said some of the articles are available, some others are not. And we also asked them where are the papers available. And I could see that the journal website is still functional, but that's not reliable because at some point somebody is going to stop paying for the hosting and domain and so on, so the site might disappear. Some relied on putting the papers in a repository. Some relied on a service such as Informit, which is an initiative in RMIT University. They host the journal's content kind of for future. But some of them surprisingly relied on web archiving service, such as the Australian National Library Pandora, which is a web archiving, national web archiving in Australia. And that is, although it saves the content from being lost, is not an optimal way for making that content available for scholarly use because it lacks functionalities such as search and browse and so on. The challenges that the journals face are related to the metric culture at universities, ranking and pressure to get indexed all of the journals because people want point, they want to publish in prestigious journals, and that prestige is perceived by Q1 or impact factor or things like that. And therefore, they are under pressure to internationalize, which means push to be included in Scopus. While you are in Scopus, you have to have perhaps other people from other countries in your editorial boards. You need to publish papers more from other countries. And therefore, you have to maybe change the scope to maintain that, citation level and so on. And as a result of that, there is a publication drain. So Australian authors don't want to publish in that lowly ranked local journal. They go for international ones, and the local journals suffer. And the other challenge is sustainable business model. If the journal is subscription-based, they have their own challenges because libraries are unlikely to subscribe to individual journals these days because it takes a lot of human resources. Somebody needs to be in charge in library to track individual subscriptions. The way they do it is they do through big deals, packages, going for consortia, or using a vendor. But to actually individually subscribe to journal, that's not probably what they do. And therefore, if you are a learner society and you have one journal which is subscription-based, you're gonna find it difficult to find people who actually pay for the subscription. If it is open access or they want to publish and use another business model, that has its own challenges, too much competition. Like if you have a university, let's imagine that we want to publish an open access with author processing charges at CSU. Managing that payment at the university is very difficult. You have to go through a long process. It's not agile, flexible, and so on. So any business model you go for, whether it is open access, it is different types of open access or subscriptions or hybrid and so on, they face their own challenges, and therefore, and we know that they don't have expertise necessarily in publishing because they're not publishers. They are academics, they are learner societies set up to do something else, but they also want to publish a journal. And journals that are good and they have like a scope that can be profitable, can be outsourced to international commercial publishers, but the rest, they might struggle in terms of sustainability of publications. Future research, as I said, we would like to continue this. We are planning to apply for grants to continue the research on Australian journals. We have some questions. I put some of them as example here, is like, how can these journals be published more sustainably? So what are the best practices for publication of a small local journal? Who publishes in these journals and how do they perceive their reputation? Like if you have I'm not sure if this was a question for me in the past. If you see a Canadian journal of something, what does that tell you? Does it make you think that it is less prestigious, or does it make you, is it a factor for you or not? How do Australian journals perform in comparison to similar journals in the same fields? And how nationally or internationally oriented are these journals in terms of the topics or the research area they publish, the authorship composition, even the citation, who is citing these journals and so on. If you have more ideas, let us know. 2 papers came out of these. We submitted to Learned Publishing Journal, which is a specialized journal in scholarly communication. The first one, we got a lot of comments. We revised and submitted again, it's under review. And the second one is also under review. Once they are out, we can share more widely. We have, I think, plenty of time to listen to your comments, experiences. If you have had anything, experience of publishing local or international journal, or you might be involved in editing or reading for local journals. But also if you have ideas or questions that we can add to those questions, or if any question you have for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamid. I should say to Hamid's being very generous when he says we. This was mostly Hamid. So I noticed Sharon made a comment in the chat. Hamid, I'm not sure if you saw that, about her experience as editor-in-chief of a society and journal that changed the name to the International Journal. Do you want to talk about that a bit, Sharon? Or?
Sure. Thank you, Hamid. This was absolutely fascinating. And there were so many points at which I'm going, yeah, because back in the sort of about 2005, I was the editor-in-chief of an international journal, and I mean, of an Australian journal, and we went through all those things that you talked about, and we had big discussions with Taylor and Francis. It was a society journal, and we decided that in order to continue, we had to become internationalized. But we've been quite strategic over the years, and I ended up being the editor-in-chief for 9 years. It's now handed on to somebody else, and we've been a Q1 journal now for quite a long time, but we became the international journal of the area. And what it's enabled us to do is give us a platform for our Australian research that's international. So we actually ended up, the June issue of every year is the best papers from our National Australian Conference are published in the June issue every year. So it sort of gives a special one issue per 6 issues. And there's each issue's just over 100 pages. It's an A4 size journal. So it's ended up, we grew it substantially, but we've dedicated this one issue per year really for an Australian voice that's kind of, you know, and I think people don't kind of recognise that. And we've also enabled us to be really strategic in how we have majority world countries submit. So we often have these sort of topics where we have research papers, but also commentary papers, where recently I've had I've run a special issue and had papers from Rwanda and Fiji and places that haven't been able to do sort of huge research that would normally get into this journal now that it's Q1, but it's enabled us to be really sensitive to our Pacific neighbours. We also have Indigenous papers that kind of contribute to topics. And so I loved your conversation about different people's solutions, and I was really sad to hear about people having to close, but I wanted to offer up an example of sort of the flip side of what we have done that has enabled our Australian voice to still be there, but also to become quite international and a Q1 journal. And it's a place that's highly sought after now. So anyway, thank you so much. That was a bit of a comment rather than a conversation. And I'm really looking forward to getting your paper, Hamid, and congratulations on being named in the Australian. That's an absolute huge honour and accolade for you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. That's true. Actually, in the literature, but we also saw that there were discussion about this negotiation that you have to do between the local function of a journal and international ones. That if you want to maintain both the voice of Australians, the local voice, but at the same time, if you're dealing with an international publisher and they want you to go for international, therefore make it more profitable and so on, it's difficult to navigate that space. And we know from colleagues like Australian Archives, and also Marianne is here in Australian Library and Information Science Association, that the other challenge that a lot of these journals have is that negotiation with the publisher. If they decide to go with the publisher and outsource the publication, they don't know how to deal with, because these are not things that people share, like societies share. It is not documented. Then everybody has to rely on their own. Maybe they pick up the phone and call another friend in another association and they see what they've done, but it's not something well documented, and there aren't many best practices. So everybody has to kind of find a way and navigate, and obviously publishers are very experienced, so they have the upper hand in a way to get what they want out of that deal.
Actually, our experience was the reverse. It wasn't the publishers making us do it. It was us making the publishers do it. So we were actually being courted by Elsevier and a few other international publishers at the time. And we went back to Taylor and Francis and said, look, we really quite like you at the time. Help us become, you know, into Scopus, Medline, everything. Help us retain our Australianisms, but also have that international reach, because we knew we were doing some really good work that the world wasn't seeing. And so we actually initiated this rather than the publisher. And now the publishers are absolutely delighted because recently a special issue that I edited for them, because I can't kind of lose them, they're a bit of my baby after being editor for 9 years. It's just had over 200,000 downloads. We took it to the UN. We've done all sorts of things. And the publisher just keeps going, yay, we like that Australian, really sort of different angle to publishing. And so Taylor and Francis just love us, but it was our initiative. So yeah, anyway, there's a different story for you.
I see Marianne and Basim. Simon, are you managing these?
Yeah, I was just about
to,
I think Marianne had turned her camera on first, so we'll go Marianne first and then you, Wasim.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to say how jealous I am of Sharon, because it was our professional association, which is the Australian Association, that wanted to keep the Australian in the journal title against the advice of the editors. So, so there's some good things about being associated with a professional association and other things that are not necessarily always so good. That's all. Yeah.
I think Wasim, I'll come to you to say, the one thing I sort of wanted to add is that a common kind of experience in doing this kind of scholarly communications research, particularly around journals, is just the sheer range, the diversity of journals. So within academic communities, different academic communities, journals serve slightly different roles, slightly different functions. There are different measures and notions of prestige amongst different sorts of researchers and different disciplines and fields. There are all sorts of different models, and many of these, especially the smaller journals, are extraordinarily reliant on individuals. And so it's fabulous to hear stories like Sharon's, where people are able to take the initiative, make strategic decisions, come to negotiations with publishers from a position of strength, but that's not always the case, of course. And so I think that's one of the reasons we want to extend this research and look for funding to look into this in more detail, is to sort of understand some of these complexities. And it's really useful to be able to kind of generalize in the way that we have in the research we've done so far, but some of the real value is understanding the complexities of these different cases.
Yeah.
Wasim, did you have a question?
Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Hamid, for sharing your research. It's quite interesting and exciting. I don't know, because whether it will be worth considering, because your research area, as you mentioned at the beginning, is scholarly communication. So I'm wondering that whether, when in your research you have noticed that like 100 research disappeared, so I'm assuming that then there is a break in the scholarly communication, or there is a decline in scholarly communication because of the absence of those avenues. So I'm wondering whether, do you think it will be worth like researching that when those avenues disappear, what impact they have actually on the people's ability, to disseminate that research, and what impact that then it will have on actually having those grassroots conversations about the issues which are nested in the local communities, because there are no avenues, right? So yeah, so just
that's a good point. I think a few things. One is that we should also acknowledge that not every journal that discontinues is a sad event or is a bad event. Some of them is natural and inevitable as the fields evolve and the disciplines change and so on. Some journals might be irrelevant. Either they have to change the scope or they have to stop the publication and so on. But the point you made, I know, for instance, if that happens, I can think about a few cases. Like we have journals in Australia, there are small journals, like we have a journal focusing on feminism in Australia. And that's the passion of like a few academics, but also they kind of drive the research in this area. If that is lost, it's like a community is lost, because that's the venue of discourse that they are having. That's like an invisible college that exists, and people do research and engage through that platform with one another. And I know that like in that journal and in the case of many other journals, they rely on individuals like professors who actually are passionate and driving that research area and editing the journal. And if that happens, you can think that easily that's going to change the discourse of research in that area, but also, you know, nobody else might be interested because they wouldn't see the outlet for their publication. But also editing a journal is like directing a research front a lot of time, because you set the agenda through the editorial that you're doing. You engage and initiate the research and so on. So it's an important thing. And the loss of that in the small fields, like in the examples that I give, it will be very obvious and visible. But in some areas, you can think that, you know, once you lose one journal, there are alternatives. What is important is the point that Simon made, that we need diversity. If all of the journals go to the path of internationalization, then you will get this homogeneity of the journals, that you're all doing the same function with the same audience and so on. And that's the risk. You want to have that diversity in terms of the publishers, in terms of the audience, in terms of the function that journals assume for themselves and so on. And we don't want that to be lost. Not sure if I answered your question. We haven't looked specifically at the literature about if somebody had already answered your questions or not, whether the impact of losing a journal on the community. But through the course of this research and the comments, and I actually had some phone call with some editors as well, I know that that's a concern, and that's would be a significant impact.
Yeah, and you should add, Hamid, that a major strand of the research that we're planning is to talk to authors about how they see the value and function of local journals, and potentially to explore what their absence means for communities. Because as you say, they serve a role in developing and sustaining communities of practice and discourse and so on. And there's also a kind of sort of substantive issue as well. You know, we've talked a lot about the arts, humanities, social sciences. In the sciences, there's also obviously geographically specific research, ecological research, flora, fauna, and so on, that is very, you know, we're in Australia, that is unique, and that provides venue for discussion around those sort of specific topics that might potentially be lost in more diverse international journals. So there is work planned to look into that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Just a vague thought. Do you think that the trend is continuing for Australian journals to go down? You know, the number of journals that are published, I guess not just Australia, but like national type or regional journals. And if so, what do you think that means for research that might be nationally specific, you know, history or other things like that? What's your feeling about how that might?
In short term, I think, because I visited the website of many of these journals, a lot of them, a good number of them, they had a statement on their website during the pandemic, because this research I just did in 2021, that they would say, they would talk about the impact of pandemic on the management of the journal. Some of them, they paused their submission. They said, we are not accepting any submission because we are overwhelmed or we can't manage the submission, and we will let you know when we reopen. I saw a few journals that actually they discontinued, and they said it was because of COVID, and that had to do probably with the loss of academic job. You know, workload was an issue for a lot of these people because they rely on voluntary work and so on. And we have seen it in our university, and you see in the news in many other universities. I saw a report that estimate was about 40,000 jobs lost in higher education in Australia. That's a big, massive number. And you think about that and the implication of that for all these journals that rely on people basically to run and manage them, I think the trend is downward, definitely, at least for some time. That probably is the trend some on other places. Of course, you know, Australia is a bit different because the language is English. If you're talking about Spain, because the local journals there are in Spanish, you're in Italy. So we are a bit different in the sense that, you know, we have the lingua franca of the science here in Australia. So journals are in English, not much different in that sense from the rest of the journals, international journals. But the impact would be, you know, in terms of the research that people do, because as we said, some of these journals, they kind of set the agenda, they direct the research front, or through the editorial work that they do, through the special issues that they set up, and so on. And it's going to be harder and harder in certain fields, at least, to find quality outlets to publish your paper, which means you have to make a compromise and make a decision whether you want the point. For instance, in our case, if I want more RPI points, I have to go with some journals. But if I know that I want to publish in that local journal because I know it's going to receive better audience, better peer review, and so on, and it contributes better to the local society, it will have better local impact, that will be a trade-off that authors will have to make a choice and make a compromise. So that's the least impact. The bigger impact that you can see that certain research areas might suffer because they don't see enough outlet, or they don't see enough interest in the research they're doing.
Yeah, it might be worth, I mean, in general, like in the 10 years that we looked, and the number of Australian journals or local journals has declined. At that same time, the number of total journals in the world has shot up, right? So there are crossing lines in this graph, and it all feeds into the, this idea of internationalization driven by the metrics by which researchers are evaluated. And it's interesting for me that having previously done research into mega journals, which are essentially the polar opposite of the local journal, right? Mega journals, international, very broad disciplinary scope, less interested in significance and interest of the paper to a community, and more interested in just checking that valid, sound research is published into these kind of vast, less like to the traditional model of the journal, more like kind of repositories of papers. And so, I think there are, I not to disagree with Hamid, but I think there are interesting questions here around the new models of publication, and to a large extent the notion of the journal is somewhat old-fashioned, right? In that it was it used to be people used to read journals, so you kept in touch with your field by reading the issues of relevant journals every month. Very few researchers do that in the same way anymore. We search for articles in databases or Google Scholar or whatever, and it's the granularity of our access to that content isn't driven by the journal, the container, so much anymore. It's driven by finding the right keywords to find individual articles. So there are questions, I think, interesting questions about the remaining value of local journals, and whether it's the same, whether that value is the same as it always has been, or whether it's valuable in new and different ways. Marianne's about to tell me that people still read Jalia from cover to cover. I'm sure they do.
But what I am interested in is, because with these mega journals, I don't know about other people, but I often get invitations to review articles I'm singularly unable to give a decent review to. That they're just so broad that they don't understand necessarily a field or expertise. And I'm not talking about shunky ones. I'm talking about, ones that I might read myself. So I just wonder, I also wonder what it means for the research communities. Hamid raised this issue, if everything's sort of mega and big and you lose containers, what will replace those containers, communities?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Mary.
No, I'm finished.
Finished. So I agree with Simon. There is need for more research, and the point he made. So the figure is 4%. So the annual growth rate of the journal title is about 4%. So every year, like 4% new titles are added to journals. But I think a lot of those are journals that you can consider international, but published by publishers such as Frontiers, MDPI, and so on. So they keep adding, and they compete, as we have seen in these comments, that they compete with these small local periphery journals, and they attract the papers, and therefore there is a publication drain in here. But even in the case of this research we did, so we submitted to this journal, Learned Publishing. This is a specialized journals in scholarly communication and publishing. And I don't think I would receive the engagement that we received from the editor of this journal for our research if I submitted to PLOS or another mega journal, or a journal that would consider we are just a platform for publication of research. And that would be the case in many other areas, like niche areas, when journals are they're not just a platform for publication and making research available, but they see it as a conversation and discourse venue for research in that area. So I think that issue that, back like 10, 15 years ago, when we were doing about research about information behavior, we had this question of, do journals matter anymore when you're reading? Do you really care about that paper? Is it from British Medical Journal? Or you go to Google Scholar, do a search, and then Google Scholar would land you in the paper, and you wouldn't even care. You wouldn't probably notice the title of the journal. You read the paper, and probably doesn't matter if it was published in a journal or it is like a mega journal or something. But I think in this case, there are implications in terms of the that conversation and discourse, but we don't know all aspects of his research.
Sorry, and I think I'm asking too many questions, but I've got one more. So one is researchers who do research that is country specific. Yours is. So and Learned Publishing is international. Did you get a comment from your peer reviewers or editor about how to make the article relevant internationally?
Not in this case, because I think they see clear implication and application for other countries. But I've had papers in the past that I received, when they don't see that clear that you did this research in Australia or Iran or Pakistan or somewhere. How is it useful for the other scholar in Korea or in Spain? So you need to make that clear. And sometimes you can, but sometimes the issue is not that applicable to other countries, and therefore you need to go for a local journal.
And that's when we miss local journals sometimes, I think, because sometimes legitimate research is local. But very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray.
I have to go to another meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, that's 1 o'clock now, so we better call it a day. I just noticed somebody's added a last comment. Kay's added a nice comment at the end there. Yes, about community networks clustering around different things rather than journals. That's a very valuable point. But I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Hamid for his presentation. I'm sure we'll hear more about this research in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Do you want to stop sharing, Hamid?
Yeah.
There we go. Good.